right, let's get started. So today we have on stage with us Bo Hines, who's the Executive Director of the Crypto Council in the Trump White House, and Tyler Williams, who earlier this year was appointed by Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent as an advisor on digital asset and blockchain policy. Thank you both for joining us.
It's a pleasure to be here. There's a lot of excitement in this building today. It's a fun environment.
All right, so why don't we start, just a question to both of you. Where are we today? Where do you believe we are in the process of making, Bitcoin a threshold question in the United States is where do we make America a global crypto superpower with respect to Bitcoin? And what steps do we need to take to make that a reality?
Well, look, I mean, first and foremost, I want to thank President Trump for his leadership in this space. I want to thank Secretary Bessent, Secretary Lutnick, the other members of the working group on digital assets that participate with White House policy here. I mean, look, this is a sea change, right? I mean, this industry is one that's been broadly beaten down, kicked down, victims of policy through prosecution, lawfare, ridiculousness that happened over the course of the last decade, more specifically under the Biden regime. And the president said at the Bitcoin conference last year he was going to establish the strategic Bitcoin reserve. He's done that. We're well on our way of becoming the Bitcoin superpower of the world. If you look at his first digital assets EO, there were some landmarks in there that are important to consider. We had the 30-day landmark, which required interagency actors to do an internal review or audit of everything they touched in the digital asset space. We had the 60-day landmark, which compelled the same actors to basically provide a list of recommendations, things that they could do independently to help us, welcome in the golden age for digital assets here in the U.S. And then now we're working diligently, as Tyler will describe, on our 180-day report, which will be more like a book to show what is the most robust framework we can possibly have to welcome innovation here in the United States, establish ourselves as that Bitcoin superpower, and really ensure that innovation is happening onshore, not going offshore.
Just to echo what Bo just said, and I would say we're back. We were in a pretty dark place a couple years ago, and we're back at reestablishing ourselves as the digital asset and Bitcoin leader in the world. And just as the Secretary said the other day, we're going big on digital assets. So Bo wrapped up what we've been working on in terms of the 30 and 60-day landmarks for the first executive order. We have a big report that we're working on that's due in July 22nd. It's really a comprehensive first ever rendition of what the government has produced on what it thinks about digital assets across the government. So it's going to cover everything from tax to market structure to Bitcoin strategic reserve, everything you can think about.
So I think that's absolutely right. We definitely saw the sea change shift in the administration change across our portfolio of companies that we work with. I would also say one of the conversations that I often have with people within the Bitcoin community is they for a long time they felt like they had regulatory clarity with respect to Bitcoin, and I think for the most part that is true. But I still think that policy and regulatory clarity for the digital asset space more broadly is very important for the Bitcoin community as it will help kind of a rising tide lifts all boats. So we'll get into kind of specific elements of the policy framework right now. Why don't we start with stablecoin legislation? So Bo, it took a lot of debate and compromise to get the Genius Act to where it is today. That is the bill that came out or is coming in the Senate right now. How are you feeling about the status of that bill and its chances of passing?
Well, I'll take just one step back before we go there, because we really look at this in three phases, right? We've had the demolition phase, in which we've removed a lot of the red tape, or as we like to call it, blue tape, over-regulation that existed under the Biden regime, and more or less that lawfare that was created really through policy, through prosecution. We feel like we've done about 80 to 90% of the legwork there with the interagency actors, with phenomenal folks like Tyler over at Treasury, with the banking regulators, and so on. And now we're in the construction phase, right? And we're relying on our colleagues on Capitol Hill, who are doing an absolutely phenomenal job of working to get Genius home. And Genius is very important for the ecosystem and for Bitcoiners, right? Because what we're looking at here is updating our archaic payment rails that have existed for quite some time. You look at technology more generally. You look at the ways in which we communicate, how that's evolved. One thing that hasn't changed is the way in which we move money. And that's something that needs to be fixed. So we're looking at a system that will create much more expeditious transactions with instant settlement times. We're looking at a system that will provide a lot more transparency. And then we're looking at something that will secure US dollar global dominance for decades to come. But with all of that, the reason that Bitcoiners should really care about this, you're talking about a massive injection of capital into the digital assets ecosystem. That is great for Bitcoiners. It's great for Bitcoin. And we are extremely excited about what's to come as a result of Genius. And I'd be remiss not to thank Senator Haggerty for his leadership in this space. Tyler, who's worked diligently in this process. Luke Pettit in Senator Haggerty's office has done a fantastic job. And we've done this in a bipartisan way with Senator Gillibrand's office. In the last vote on cloture, I think we had close to 15 Democrats sign on. This is something that's not partisan. This is about revolutionizing our financial system, taking the technologies that come out of the digital asset space, plugging them into traditional systems, and creating an environment that welcomes innovation and establishes the U.S. as not only the global Bitcoin superpower, but the crypto capital of the world.
I think that's a great point.
Can I just jump in real quick on that?
go
I
ahead.
couldn't agree with more of what Bo said. I would just echo, the last time the Senate has acted on a financial services bill in a bipartisan manner is 2018, and we've seen a drastic shift in the matter of weeks in terms of adoption of stablecoin legislation in the U.S. Senate. That should not be lost upon anyone here. And I think we should just underscore the fact that I've had no less than 15 meetings with other foreign central banks and monetary authorities, and the rest of the world is watching as well. And they're quite impressed by the bipartisan effort that's been going on in the Senate on this.
Yeah, I think we like to joke that I think crypto and Bitcoin might be the most bipartisan issue in D.C. at this point.
Should be. It should be, for sure.
So Tyler, back to you. What part does Treasury play in all of this, and what are you hoping comes from stablecoin legislation?
Well, we played quite an active role in terms of working with Congress, in terms of providing technical assistance. For those who don't know how Treasury is structured, there's sort of three core verticals in main Treasury. There's domestic finance, there's international affairs, and then there's the terrorism and financial intelligence vertical, and then obviously there's some bureaus within Treasury, the IRS and the Office of the Comptroller of the Currency. So we have lots of vectors of sort of institutional excellence that we can lend upon to provide technical assistance. Moreover, if the bill becomes law, and I hope it does, knock on wood, should it become law, Treasury will play an active role in terms of negotiating reciprocal agreements with other foreign sovereign jurisdictions, working with the bank regulators, working with the states. So we'll have quite an active role. And I think Bo and I were sort of the first rendition of crypto people working in the government. If this becomes law, there'll be sort of a domain expertise because we'll have a lot of work to do to implement the legislation.
Yeah, that sounds great. And I think that the connective tissue, Bo, that you were speaking about between the legacy financial system and Bitcoin, stablecoins, everything like that really will be paved with stablecoin legislation. So it's really a huge step forward.
Well, and the one thing I'll add to that too is this can act as the foundation for what we can build upon in this space. You start talking about tokenized public securities and 24/7 markets and these things that folks have dreamed about for a long time. Updating the payment rails is a necessity in order to get there, and I think that we're well on our way of achieving that. And we'd be remiss also just not to thank our brilliant AI and crypto czar, David Sachs, for his leadership in all of this. His reputation precedes him. He's obviously a brilliant business person, but he's been super involved in just ushering this and being the guiding star to point us in the right direction. So I know you guys are going to hear from him later in the day. That'll be certainly a treat.
All right, so maybe turning to market structure. I think that's the next piece of legislation that's on the horizon. Market structure really deals with kind of, how do you regulate intermediaries within the digital asset space, like exchanges, brokers, dealers, as well as kind of token classification. So how do you tell if a token is regulated like a security or like a commodity? What are the key provisions of that legislation from your perspective, and what steps are needed to make sure that market structure legislation is successful?
Well, look, the industry needs clarity, like any other space. If we want folks to innovate here, they can't be fearful that when they walk into the SEC and pitch something that they're going to be writing their Wells notice before they can get on the elevator. This is a completely different environment in which folks have been operating in over the course of the last decade. Our interagency actors in the working group are begging us to tell industry folks, come in, pitch us new ideas. Let's innovate here onshore. And our message to folks that have gone offshore is welcome home, truly. We want you here in the United States. We want you building here. We want you creating new things. And I can speak on behalf of all of our interagency actors in the working group that are encouraging and fostering this innovation. With market structure, what we're able to do is provide that clear regulatory authority that's necessary for folks to build. That's, what is a security, what is a commodity, where is the line, who has regulatory authority over what you're building. That's extremely important. And then, if you want to pitch something new, we need to have the flexibility to be able to offer insights as to how you do that here and have access to U.S. capital markets. At the end of the day, if you want to be the crypto capital of the world, you need folks innovating here. You need folks IPOing here. We want that innovation staying right here in the United States.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And again, going back to what we were saying earlier, I think Bitcoin has long probably had clarification when it comes to that delineation between a security or commodity, but a lot of the rest of the industry hasn't had that. And that doesn't mean that more clarity for the rest of the industry doesn't also benefit Bitcoin, because again, right, creating a regulatory framework that is going to help push against scams and frauds and everything like that should lift the entire community and the entire digital asset ecosystem.
Maybe I'll jump right in on just add one quick thought on that. I think that Chairman Hill and the Financial Services Committee has done an excellent job in his leadership in pushing for market structure legislation. I would say, as we think about what market structure legislation should look like, pardon? As we think about what market structure legislation should look like, we should remember sort of the core innovations of Bitcoin, the core innovations of decentralized finance, because we do have different elements. So if you think about traditional market structure, it's typically relied on sort of this principal to agent relationship. And what we have is a different innovation, different technological innovation, where we're moving and we should be more accepting of sort of this principal to principal relationship that is different, it's unique, and it has different challenges and different opportunities. So we're actively working, as Bo said, on an interagency process, trying to formulate the best ideas for that.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. So Tyler, maybe back to you. How do you think that market structure, legislation could accelerate Bitcoin adoption? I know that one of the things that will be covered there is kind of regulating on-ramps and off-ramps. Again, creating more connective tissue with the legacy financial system, the banking system, which could stand to benefit Bitcoin adoption. What do you think about that?
Well, I kind of think it's a rising tide lifts all boats. And a couple years ago, the industry had spent so much time and energy advocating for the ETP marketplace in the U.S. And what we saw is very quickly afterwards, there was a institutional adoption that happened for Bitcoin. And I think it will be the same thing in the United States if we have market structure legislation and if we have stablecoin legislation, a sound regulatory regime that invites the industry to create and innovate in the United States is what we want, and that's what our job is.
Yeah, totally agree. So Bo, maybe to you, I think Tyler mentioned this a little bit. I think one of the defining principles of Bitcoin, right, is the fact that it created this decentralized blockchain and a digital asset that is associated with it, and that threshold of decentralization, the question of these systems operating without human control is a really kind of key linchpin of market structure legislation. Trying to basically set a goal for other digital assets and ecosystems to operate in the way that Bitcoin does. What do you think about the importance of kind of decentralization control and how it plays a role in the market structure legislation?
Well, it's immensely important, and this is the line that folks have been trying to draw for quite some time in the space, right? I mean, Bitcoin is truly the golden standard, and that's why we say Bitcoin is digital gold. We make no bones about that, and I've said repeatedly, as the United States, we want as much of it as we can possibly get. That's why we created the SBR in the way that we've done. We recognized it for being unique. Obviously, it's a commodity, not a security. Has intrinsic stored value. As David likes to say, it has the immaculate conception, right? This is an asset that we should be harnessing on behalf of the American people, and we're working diligently as a working group to figure out those budget-neutral ways in which we can accumulate more. And I always tell journalists that ask me all the time, how much do you want? Again, I'll say repeatedly here today, that's a very silly question. We want as much as we can possibly get, and I'll say it ad nauseum the rest of the time that I'm here. But I think that we showed that we recognized that for being unique in the way that we set up the strategic Bitcoin reserve, we have the digital assets national stockpile, which is different. And in this SBR, we said two things. One, we want to accumulate more, and two, we're not going to sell any Bitcoin that we possibly have in U.S. government, period.
So turning back to the bipartisanship discussion, I mean, obviously, I do think that the crypto is one of the most bipartisan issues in DC at the moment, but obviously it is not totally bipartisan, and there are some voices on both sides of the aisle that seek to try and make it a little bit more partisan. How do you all view that? How do you view the challenge in navigating the partisanship that might exist in certain pockets? And do you think it's a good goal to try and keep things bipartisan?
Well, it is a commodity in Washington, bipartisanship, so I don't think we should overlook that. I think if you want durable law, you have to have it. And we've seen, 16 and 18 senators on the Democratic side that supported the Genius Act on the cloture votes last week. So, that shouldn't be scoffed at by any stretch. That's quite a big bipartisan vote, and I expect that it will only increase. And I think part of it is a little bit of momentum. You have to put a win on the scoreboard and move forward. And a lot of it is still an education phase. So as people learn more, as congressional members and senators learn more about stablecoins and learn more about programmable money on the internet, the more they get interested in Bitcoin, the more they get interested in other digital assets. So I think it's a little bit of an inertia. You have to, push the stone and see how far you can let it roll.
I think Tyler mentioned something that's extremely important here. In terms of garnering partisan support, or bipartisan support, excuse me, it's more or less an education process. And that's one thing that we've run into repeatedly is a lot of these legislators still don't understand the space. They're not living it and breathing it every day like many of us are. And so I think that when they start to recognize, one, the power of Bitcoin, the power of this blockchain, moreover, the power of what's being built in other ecosystems, maybe not at the same decentralization standard, but there's still good technology coming out of other places in the space. It helps them understand how important this is for the American people, how important it is for us to lead the charge globally in harnessing this technology, plugging it into our current ecosystems, and really revolutionizing our financial system for decades to come. And as we start having these conversations more and more, you start seeing more of our Democratic colleagues come on. And I'll say again, this should be the least partisan effort that possibly exists in this Congress. I think that folks are recognizing that. It makes me extremely optimistic about what's to come, not only with Genius and stablecoin legislation, but with market structure moreover. And then enshrining the SBR into law is going to be next.
Amazing. Bo, maybe asking you a little bit about President Trump. We will hear from Vice President J.D. Vance tomorrow. But what do you hear from President Trump about crypto and about Bitcoin? We've seen him speak at crypto events before. Can you give us an inside scoop on what he thinks and cares about most?
Well, he certainly recognizes how important it is for the United States to lead the globe in terms of, one, being the Bitcoin superpower, and two, being the crypto capital of the world. I mean, he's said that repeatedly. The president cares deeply about this space. He's made it a priority from the very beginning. He signed an executive order on digital assets on day 3. He created the Digital Assets Working Group, in which he's created a streamlined process for us to innovate, for us to put out fires, for us to allow us to foster an environment that leads to innovation here and welcome back those folks that have left our shores. He established the first AI and crypto czar. He established the first position in the White House on the Crypto Council and the executive director, which is myself. Tyler's the counselor now to the Treasury Secretary on digital assets. I mean, he is showing real force and real momentum here, and he's absolutely serious about delivering on his promises. I think that we've done a lot of that thus far. These legislative priorities will act as the backstop, and we'll clean the rest up through interagency activity. But we can't thank the president enough for his leadership. Without him, we would not be here today. This environment would not be what it is today, and Bitcoin would not be having the success it is right now without his leadership. So we're immensely thankful for him.
That's great. Tyler, maybe just to ask you the same question with respect to Secretary Besson. I know that he's been speaking a lot about digital assets recently. What is your views about his inside views about the industry?
Yeah, I mean, as you said yesterday on TV, we're going big on digital assets. And I think moreover, if you look at his career, he's been a macro investor, macro thinker his entire career. And I think, as he thinks about how we've lost track in the United States of leadership on innovation, leadership on Bitcoin, leadership in digital assets, it's a strategic error. And so now we're in the process of re-underwriting that and bringing it back on shore. So I think that's sort of his worldview about it.
Yeah, that's great. So I know that both of you have now been in DC working on with the industry for several months. I know that it's been a whirlwind. You've been meeting with tons of different entrepreneurs, venture capitalists, investors, all sorts of industry actors. What concerns are you hearing from the Bitcoin community and the industry more broadly about what they're looking for from a regulatory perspective and policy-wise? I know, Bo, when you started kind of saying that first was kind of deconstructing all of the damage that had been done over the course of the last 4 years. But what are you hearing from the community more broadly?
Look, I kind of view my role in the White House as almost being an administrator and/or Sherpa between White House policy, industry, interagency activity, and what's happening on Capitol Hill. So this, the president's given us broad authority to solicit feedback from industry players. I've probably had no less than 250 meetings with different industry folks over the course of the last 5 months. Both big and small, Goliaths in the space to startups. We want to hear from everyone. What challenges are they dealing with? What can we do to foster a better environment for them to build here? What can we do for Bitcoiners? What can we do for this environment? And I think that right now there's just a lot of optimism and hope that wasn't there a year ago. And that's a very exciting thing. We want to continue to foster that, continue to innovate. I think with crypto, we have very clear objectives of what we need to accomplish. We need to protect self-custody as one, protect the rights of privacy to people. We need to make sure that we're creating an environment which people have that clear regulatory authority so that they can innovate. And we need to create a backstop that's lasting. And we do that on Capitol Hill through legislation. So I'm immensely confident we're going to deliver on the president's priorities before August recess. We're going to have the most robust and clear regulatory environment that exists in the world as it pertains to digital assets. And you'll certainly see the United States stepping out as the Bitcoin superpower of the world.
Amazing. Tyler, how about you?
I think I've done just as many meetings as Bo, if not slightly less maybe. But I would say, at Treasury we have an open door policy, so we hear all sorts of commentary. We've spent a lot of time working on illicit finance matters. We spent a lot of time working on tax policy issues that affect Bitcoin miners and affect different participants in the ecosystem. We spent a lot of time thinking about how do we onshore activities and entities that have been pushed offshore over the years. So, everything from banking to market structure, the whole 9 yards, we think about it and we're trying to get smart on it because we ultimately have to write on it and put it in this report that I mentioned earlier. So I would say to the audience, the message is if you're in Washington and want to come see us, it's an open door invitation.
All right, that's great. So now that we've kind of heard what you guys are doing, I guess the question becomes, what should we do? What should the larger, broader community do to help kind of with these efforts and move things forward?
Well, tell your legislators why this is so important for you. I mean, that makes our job a lot easier as we go through this legislative process and we try to mend the gap between, just the education gap that exists in terms of helping folks understand why this is so important in the United States. I think that these legislators hearing from their constituents, hearing from industry is extremely important and powerful. And we saw that with the Genius Act. This was the first time that all of industry came together to support a piece of legislation, and we were able to push it home and do it in a bipartisan way. So we need to keep that momentum forward going into market structure, and we need to keep that momentum forward into enshrining the SBR through congressional activity, and we'll be in a great place.
Yeah, I would echo that. Just help us keep the momentum going.
All right, well, with that, I think we're at time. I think for everyone here, I hope that this conversation gave you a sense of why there's reason for optimism. I like to tell people that I'm more optimistic now about the chances of getting successful policy and regulatory clarity in place than I've ever been in my time in this space, and this is part of the reason why. So thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks for having us.
God bless you all.